Now it'll be Kirby and Nick, former defensive coordinator against the big boss. Stylistically, you know what you're going to get. That Georgia run game, that Bama run game, the great backers, and a whole lot of SEC ball coming right in Atlanta. 24-6. Clemson held to 188 total yards by that refreshed Bama defense.
Welcome into another edition of Tide and Tiger, the post-playoff edition where we'll talk a little recruiting and what happened with Alabama and Clemson. Scott Griffin here, Rodney Orr of TiderInsider.com. There's a lot of chatter. There's a lot of talk on how Alabama dominated Clemson, yet some question marks out there. Rodney, how are you today?
Doing great, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Let's get your first impressions. I'll throw in some thoughts as we go, but Alabama certainly dominant defensively in the game last night, 24-6, holding Clemson to about 180-plus yards after giving up 500-plus in the previous two meetings from the previous 2 years. So completely different story this time around.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, obviously the Alabama defense was dominant, but let's be honest, it's kind of what we said headed in. It's amazing how much one guy can make a difference. Deshaun Watson, his presence not there. I mean, that's certainly the biggest difference between, the last couple of years. Obviously, when, Clemson put up, 75 points, I think it was, against Alabama over the last 2 years. And those were great defenses, as you remember, Scott, two of the best maybe that Nick Saban's had, certainly, here at Alabama. So that was obviously a huge difference. But I'll say this clearly, the Alabama defense, which had kind of been criticized a little bit, maybe since the Mississippi State game, LSU game, maybe even not playing the same kind of brand, maybe the physical up front, stuff in the run game, all of those things had received a lot of criticism. But I tell you what, they were dominant last night, holding Clemson to 64 yards rushing. So I think when you look at that, you look at the play that Anthony Jennings made in the third quarter was really kind of a game-turning play when he hit Bryant and Deron Payne ended up with the ball, and then you had the horse collar penalty, and Alabama went on to score. And then shortly thereafter, you had Levi Wallace made a fantastic play to tip the ball up in the air on a pass breakup, and Mack Wilson returned it for a touchdown. So the defense really was the difference in this game for Alabama.
There's no question about it, and Clemson coming in as a strong running team, and they did it, as you know, by committee, basically. Kelly Bryant was a huge part of that, but even with him and just some late bending as well, Clemson only has 64 yards rushing. We knew Kelly Bryant couldn't pass like Deshaun Watson. He only had 124, but just stopping the run and putting Clemson in those long third down situations was very key for Alabama.
Yeah, we talked about that actually on one of our recent podcasts that, the key would be stopping their running game first and foremost. And I think Alabama really looked at it like this, Scott. When Bryant was going to throw, they were going to really pressure. I think Alabama felt like it had a huge edge outside going against the Clemson offensive tackles that maybe weren't quite as good as, what people thought. So Alabama really took advantage of that, had a lot of pressure on the quarterback. We saw Rashaan Evans, Deshaun Hand, Terrell Lewis, all of those guys, Raekwon Davis.
Anthony Jennings was terrific.
Anthony Jennings was a beast. And unfortunately, while we're talking about that, it looks like he is out with the knee injury, of course, for this upcoming championship game against Georgia. It does look like Anthony Jennings, from my information, will miss the game. So that's a big loss for Alabama right there. But, again, Alabama drew up, certainly got a lot of pressure on Kelly Bryant, and I think that was a big difference.
Yeah, no question. And Alabama certainly looked like the Alabama defense of old and they have struggled to do that a lot of times this year with the injuries and different things. But certainly against Clemson, they were spectacular, and Clemson was really never in this football game. I mean, you talked about the defensive touchdown with Mac Wilson, and then, of course, Daron Payne setting up another very short drive for a touchdown. I think this game would have ended 10-6, don't you, even without those plays?
Well, Clemson was actually driving as you were talking about it, and it was a 10-6 game. They had a chance to take the lead until that series that we just talked about, those two plays. They kind of turned everything around. I mean, it was a close game on the scoreboard. But to be honest with you, Scott, as we start kind of flipping the page here, going to the offensive side, the game probably should not have been that close. I think Alabama left a lot of points on the table offensively. The defense and the special teams set them up with great field position time and time again. And Alabama struggled to score points, which is what we've talked about for, the whole season basically, is that, against these better defenses, Alabama's offense has struggled to score points. They've really struggled in the passing game. Once again, Jalen Hurts was 16 of 24 for, I think 120. They had a couple that were dropped, but a couple of those two guys were, running open. Ridley was 5 yards behind the secondary, and they don't get the ball to him on a flea flicker. And also you had some throws that you had to have some sliding attempts at making the catch. So, again, Alabama struggling throwing the football on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there was a lot of missed throws by Jalen Hurts. And a lot, of course, people are going to take this as criticism, and I guess really it is at the end of the day. A guy that's played for 2 years does not need to be missing that many throws, and the numbers show it. He had 120 yards passing. Kelly Bryant, who everybody would agree, well, he wasn't that good. Well, he had 124. So he had more. He had 4 more yards passing than Jalen Hurts, and even the completions were off there. Now, so I agree with you. Let's get to the intel that we heard about, that Matt Zenas heard about, and a lot of people, that Tua Tagovailoa was set to get a lot of reps. You had already talked about he had a great 2 or 3 weeks of practices. There was talk that Jalen Hurts had been sick a little bit, and that maybe Alabama was going to throw Tua Tagovailoa in there for some reps. It never happened. So just kind of talk about that a little bit. I've got an opinion on it, but let me hear yours first.
Well, I think that Alabama controlled the football game from the start. I think that's what happened defensively. I think you could see that Clemson probably wasn't going to score much. And that's kind of the way it turned out. The defense just dominated the game. And they really were not in a position, I think, to make some of those changes there at the quarterback spot and allowing Tua to come in. But, I do think they had a plan for him to come in if there was a struggle. Jalen continued to struggle, and they needed to try to find a spark offensively. But the defense just dominated so much that it really almost made the lack of offensive production something that was not a concern in terms of losing the football game. So, again, you go right back to the defense and say that that was the difference in the game.
And the things we're talking about, and people will think we're nitpicking, but really I think against a very good team where it's not this kind of dominant performance by the defense, it could be problematic for Alabama. And we're talking about Jalen Hurts staring down Calvin Ridley on the first touchdown pass. He's wide open on his initial move on a 15-yard pass, and Jalen Hurts doesn't pull the trigger. He scrambles, then finds him. We're talking about even Daron Payne on the touchdown, where Jalen Hurts is rolling right and waits too long to get him the ball, and Daron Payne has to do a toe touch, amazingly, for a defensive lineman to get that touchdown. And then, of course, the sack where Jalen had 5 to 6 seconds probably to throw the football, didn't get rid of it, and cost Alabama a lot of time there before the half. Major mistakes for a guy that a lot of people are going to make excuses and say, well, he's only a sophomore. Look, he's had more starts than a lot of seniors, so I don't want to hear that. These are mistakes, in my opinion, that a guy this seasoned, an SEC Offensive Player of the Year and a 2-year starter, should not be making. These aren't, where you're confused about the play. You're already a year into a new offensive coordinator. So the excuses are out the window, are they not?
Well, I think you make a lot of good points. He's, 27-game starter now. I mean, I don't know a lot of quarterbacks at Alabama that started 27 games. So he's got experience. There's no question about that. He's been well-schooled, and he's been well-schooled by Brian Dable. I do think he's obviously struggled with confidence throwing the football on a consistent basis. I do say this, too. There's been some criticism of the offensive line at times and their pass protection. I thought it was fantastic last night against one of the best defensive fronts in the country. I mean, there's no question what Clemson's defensive front is noted for. They sacked Jarek Stidham earlier in the season, 11 times, I think it was, in their win over Auburn.
Yeah.
So that's a great defensive front. I give the offensive line great kudos for what they did last night in terms of protecting Jalen. But, I think the game plan was pretty simple, Scott, for Jalen Hurts last night. It was a one-read game plan. They wanted to get him out on the edge and to give him a run-pass option on a lot of plays, which they tried to do. And if that guy's not open, if the first guy, the read, is not open, then he had the ability to tuck it and run. So they did some of that and certainly got back to giving the ball to the running backs. Damian Harris had 19 carries. But again, I agree with you. A lot of the throws were simple, basic throws, slant routes that he made a couple of nice throws on slant routes, which again is a simple, basic throw. Some of the little flare routes and those types of things, hitches, quick passes. So they did a pretty good job on those. But it's just the lack of ability to stand in the pocket and make throws down the field to receivers breaking open that I think continues to kind of keep this Alabama offense stunted in terms of its growth.
There's no question, in my opinion, that you're correct on that. And a lot of people are going to act like are nitpicking and all that, but it is what it is. Again, if you can't see that the defense totally dominated and won this game and the offense had 280 yards, and some missed opportunities, then you're just not watching the football game. But let's hear from Jalen Hurts. He's had that screensaver of the last year's game, and he says, and Nick Saban agrees, they were motivated, no question, to be playing Clemson this year from last year.
We had a mentality that you don't remember the wins, you remember the losses. And I think we never forgot what happened, but we wanted to take it in as a learning experience. We wanted to learn from it, and we had the opportunity to do that today and display it, and we overcame it, and we got them. So we move on to the national championship game.
This is something that I'm really, really pleased and happy for our players. They really worked hard for this game, and they certainly had the right mental attitude about getting after it in this game. And it was a little bit personal, I think, for us after what happened to us in this game last year. Really, really pleased for our players. Very, very proud of our team. I think this game was about sort of our identity as a team, and I don't think that anybody could question the relentless competitive attitude that we played with, warrior-like mentality out there, and it's certainly what we needed. There's things that we could have obviously done better, but I'm really proud of the way our guys competed in the game, and I think that was a difference in the game.
Okay, Rodney, react to that. Obviously, Alabama had a little extra focus going into this game beyond the fact they're in the college football playoffs.
Well, I think so. The last 2 years, obviously, they've had those classic games, Alabama winning it in 2015, some really memorable plays in that game. Obviously, the onside kick, Kenyon Drake's touchdown run that was the cover of Sports Illustrated. And then last year when Alabama had only surrendered 14 points through three quarters, and Clemson explodes for 21 points in the fourth quarter with Alabama's worn-out defense because, again, as we've talked about before, the offense could not sustain any drives, and Deshaun Watson hitting Hunter Renfrow for the game-winning touchdown that was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. So two really classic matchups, and you wondered, could part three live up to those two? Obviously, it was a different tone in the game, this time, but you knew that there was a lot riding on the outcome, Scott. When you just talk about perception, there were people talking about, well, Clemson could become the first team in the history of college football to win 13 games in a season for three consecutive years. Obviously, Alabama kept them from doing that. Now, guess what? If Alabama can find a way to beat Georgia in the national championship game next Monday night, Alabama would become the first team in the history of college football to win 13 games or more in a single season. So that's kind of an interesting side note. And there were those who were saying if Dabo Swinney wins this game, he's all of a sudden supplanted Nick Saban as the head coach in college football. So, again, that didn't happen. And I think Nick Saban clearly still, sits at the top of the perch if you want to talk about perception-wise in terms of the best coach in college football. But there were a lot of things in that regard that were on the line in terms of what people talk about.
Well, let's hear from Dabo Swinney, who is obviously disappointed with the outcome against his alma mater, as everybody's talking about the trilogy, Game 3 of this great series.
Alabama's number one scoring defense in the country for a reason, and you gotta make the critical plays, and we didn't do that. We did it last year. We didn't do it this year. We came here to win, and just incredibly disappointed in our performance. But credit goes to Alabama. Congratulations to Alabama. They were the better team today. No question about it.
Now, I will say this, Rodney, what you're talking about on Dabo Swinney. If he's not in the same class, he's certainly getting closer and closer, because when you look at that Clemson team and their lack of throwing from the quarterback position, their lack of a big play wide receiver, their lack of a big play running back, some of the things they had to endure, I thought that was an amazing coaching job for Dabo Swinney to have this team in the Final Four.
Yeah, I think so. No question. They were number one in the country. I mean, and let's be honest. Dabo's between quarterbacks right now. He had Deshaun Watson. Kelly Bryant's done a really nice job. Dabo and his staff have done a great job bringing him along this year. He had a good year, threw for over 2,600 yards, and was an outstanding runner as well, over 600 yards rushing. But their future is probably going to be Trevor Lawrence, a true freshman that will enter school here soon at Clemson. He might be their next great one. And, of course, they do have a true freshman there now who was an outstanding five-star recruit last year, Hunter Johnson, who played some this year and was pretty good.
Yeah.
So one of those two guys, Scott, will eventually be his outstanding quarterback of the future. And you'll see Dabo continue to have his presence and Clemson's presence in the playoffs. They're certainly lurking as one of the top teams.
Scott Griffin here, Titan Tiger. Rodney Orr of Tiger Insider talking about Alabama, Clemson. Now let's go to Georgia, who looked very good. They came from a deficit down to a really good and dangerous Oklahoma team, certainly dangerous offensively. Got the defense straightened out in the second half. Raekwon Smith looked terrific second half. Jake Fromm looks fantastic as a freshman quarterback. They're letting him make throws and plays in their offense. And I thought they won a very difficult game. How do we see Alabama with Jalen Hurts? He's really got to step up his performance, does he not, as far as sharpness, getting the ball out, not having mental lapses when he's throwing the football, doesn't he, against that Georgia defense?
Yeah, this Georgia defense. Kirby Smart's done an incredible job. He really has. I had doubts about Kirby as a head coach coming in with no experience at a job like Georgia after Mark Richt had won 150 games in 15 years. I really questioned that, but Kirby Smart has done an incredible job in his second year. He's really kind of turned around the mindset over there. They've become a very physical football team. They're really tough competitors, Scott. When you look at that game yesterday, they were behind Oklahoma 31-14 right before half. They got a break on that squib kick, got the field goal, cut it to 31-17. But they came out in the second half. They made some adjustments, and they dominated the line of scrimmage in the third quarter completely. I mean, they took Oklahoma over. And that was very impressive because that is an outstanding offensive football team, a great quarterback in Baker Mayfield, a guy that makes a ton of plays. Now, again, Oklahoma finally kind of got back on track and the game started going back and forth. But still, I thought that was a really tough matchup for Georgia in terms of, trying to slow down Baker Mayfield enough to get back in the game. But they did, and they took advantage of it. Now, I'll say this, too. Oklahoma's defense, that's as bad of a defense, I think, as I've seen since Texas A&M in 2013 and 14. If you remember, those two defenses were really, really bad. Alabama scored 49 and 59 on those two defenses, if you remember. But I just thought it was a bad defense, but still, you have to give credit to that running game of Georgia's. That takes a lot of pressure off from, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, those guys are outstanding running backs, big play backs, power backs. They can run with power, speed, all of those things. DeAndre Swift's another outstanding player. He's a third running back. Fromm has done an outstanding job. Hey, let's not forget, Jake Fromm originally was committed to Alabama. Kirby flipped him to Georgia when he took that job. But again, he's managed things well. Seems to have a maturity beyond his years, to be honest with you, Scott. And the crazy thing is even in the first game, you could sense that this guy was not your average freshman quarterback in terms of, just his feel for the game and the way it did not seem to bother him. Sometimes it's too big for a young player like that, but it certainly hasn't been that for Jake Fromm. Makes some really good throws. Now, I'm telling you, this guy's not just a game manager. He's become more and more of a threat as he's gained some confidence, throwing the football. I mean, he can make some throws. There's no question about that.
Yeah, they've grown him. You could tell that he has grown from that on the game where he still had to make plays to what we saw in the Rose Bowl. They have let the leash out a little bit longer, and conversely, we haven't really seen that with Jalen Hurts and Alabama. And this stat, to me, has to change. Alabama was 16 completions. You pointed it out earlier. 7 to wide receivers. 4 to Ridley, 2 to Ruggs, and then 1, the official book has Hootie Jones. We know it was Devontae Smith. Hootie Jones is out. So not even
and
half.
He's a safety.
Right. Not even half the completions are to wide receivers. Right. 7 went to backs. And I love the throwing game to the backs. But let's be honest, Alabama's doing a lot of that because it's a safe throw for Jalen Hurts. Can they get away with a similar attack against a defense like Georgia, in your opinion?
Boy, I tell you, it's going to be rough, like that. Georgia will be really dialed in defensively. I think that, their main concern with Hurts would be just his running and kind of keeping him bottled up. And other than that, I think they probably feel pretty confident, against this Alabama offense. Though the offensive line's performed well. Obviously, you've got some outstanding running backs led by Damian Harris. Hopefully, Josh Jacobs will be back and ready to go. He had a little bit of a pulled hamstring, but he still played a little bit against Clemson.
Yeah, not a lot.
Bo Scarborough's been a little bit banged up. But let me tell you, Najee Harris had some really great practices, the true freshman from California. He had some outstanding practices over the last 2 weeks, and we saw him catch that little flare pass, made a big play. He's going to be a guy that eventually is – let me tell you, we saw a flash on that one play, that 22-yard reception he had. He's going to be outstanding, but we'll see what happens in terms of his playing time against Georgia. But, Scott, the running game there's a lot of pressure when you're trying to run the football against a defense like Georgia. They've got great linebackers. You mentioned Roquan Smith, first-team All-American. And trying to run it against that defensive front without a threat of throwing the football, you're gonna have to create a threat. You're gonna have to make some throws. So I expect it to be a really good defensive football game. The edge, obviously, on the offensive side right now, to me, is Georgia. We'll see how they can run the football against this Alabama defensive front, which had their most dominant game since probably Florida State, maybe even more dominant than that one.
Look,
but I just think they got to make some adjustments in the passing game.
Well, and if they don't, Rodney, is what I was going to say. Alabama has to play a defensive game like we saw against Clemson, I think.
Right.
I mean, and I think I'm not so sure if you could poll Nick Saban and maybe some of the coaches that a tight, close game doesn't favor Alabama for this very reason.
Yeah, I think you're probably right because I think Georgia's better offensively. Again, I thought Clemson was okay on offense. Kelly Bryant, not a great threat throwing the football. I thought their offensive tackles were a little weak. Now, you look at Georgia, Sam Pittman's done a great job with their offensive line. They're much better, much improved. They run the football extremely well with Chubb and Michelle. We mentioned that. And so I think in a close game, they've got a real identity when you talk about Georgia. They run the football. They can play action. Fromm can do some things in the throwing game. They just seem to have more of an identity offensively than what we've seen from Alabama.
Well, it's going to be a terrific game, as we know. And again, my thought is kind of like yours, that a tight, close defensive game favors Alabama. And they do have to get the running game going a little bit better. Bo Scarborough, 12 carries, 24 yards. Damian Harris, as you said, 19 for 77, not bad. Jalen Hurts, 11 for 40. He had a sack or two, but, his longest gain was out of the passing formation. So we really didn't see him go nuts in the run game either. And certainly Alabama has to have those numbers go up, which eases the pressure on Jalen Hurts.
Yes, it does. And, again, you never really know. There's always some X factors in these games, Scott. And, one of those X factors might be experience. Georgia has a lot of experienced players, but this is their first time playing in a game like this. Obviously they played in the Rose Bowl against Baker Mayfield. What an incredible performance. I said that again. It's a great experience for them. And but when you're talking about playing for all of it, I'm talking about everything's on the line. And you've got a coach that's in his second year. They've got a young staff. Yeah, certainly I know that Kirby's got a lot of experience, as a coordinator here at Alabama in some of these big games. But again, I think the newness of it for them is going to be interesting to see, what do they do? How do they respond in the big game when it's all on the line? And, certainly maybe that could be an X factor. What happens on the sidelines?
Yeah, I think you're correct. And sometimes a strange name or person steps up and has a monster game on either side here. So we'll have to see what happens with Alabama and Georgia. I think it's a tight game. It's a good game. A lot of, criticism coming from across the country about SEC. But you know what? You have 4 teams. You played your way in. The committee of unbiased people put 2 SEC teams in, and they won. So they're going to be there for that. I know Danny Cannell hates it, but, so what? He can go stick it for all I'm concerned, with his goofy and ridiculous looks at these things. Let's talk a little recruiting. Before we get into where Alabama is right now, and especially going against Georgia, who they go head-to-head with a lot, as you know, let's wrap up a little bit since we didn't have a chance with the holidays, and personally I've been a little sick, and I appreciate everybody give me a chance to get a little bit better here. With the early signing period for Alabama, there were some surprises. Tennessee got a tight end. Georgia maybe got a couple of guys. But Alabama still, I thought, finished pretty strong in that December early period.
Yeah, they did. Signing 15, obviously. I thought, as we've talked about many times, the 2 priorities on the defensive side, on the defensive front, and in the secondary, Alabama had a strong early signing period. They got the guy that I think is the best pass rusher in the country. We've seen Terrell Lewis. We saw him last night, and I think this guy Yabi Anoma out of Baltimore, Maryland. I think he's the premier pass rushing guy in the country right now. He had 24 sacks this past season, Scott. Also, On the other side, Jordan Davis out of Memphis Southwind. Now, both of these guys did sign. Jordan Davis had 22 sacks this past year. So there's your two really outstanding pass rushing type guys on the outside. They held on and signed Stephon Wynn out of IMG Academy down in Bradenton, Florida, originally from South Carolina. His dad, by the way, played at Clemson and was an outstanding player. So Stephon is more of an interior type defensive lineman. I think he's going to be a Dalvin Tomlinson type player, to be honest with you. And then Christian Barmore started off the Wednesday morning of signing day, that signing day period of 3 days. He was the first guy that kind of pulled the trigger and committed. He was uncommitted heading into the day and made an early morning commitment, signed later that day. But a 6'6", 290-pound defensive lineman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who really burst on the scene this year, had a ton of offers, came down to Alabama and Georgia for him, and Christian Barmore signed with Alabama. So you've got Stephon Wynn inside, you've got Christian Barmore, and then Bobby Brown on Friday, just before the signing period ended. Though he did not sign, he verbally committed to Alabama. 6'4", Scott. He is now up to 298 pounds. We spoke to him after his commitment. He started the season at 285, so he's gotten bigger. This is a really good-looking player. I mean, now that you've got Bobby Brown, Stephon Wynn, Christian Barmore, those are three outstanding players up front, along with those two guys on the outside, Enoma and Davis, that I mentioned. And they'd probably like to take one more. They're in on Tyler Friday from Don Bosco Prep up in New Jersey, Ramsey, New Jersey. He's a guy that's an outstanding player. Michigan and Ohio State very much in that picture as well. And then Malik Langham, I think he's got a ton of potential out of Huntsville Lee. He's a guy that I think's underrated. He's 6'5", 270. He's going to be an outstanding player, at some point when he gets in college, maybe at the red shirt and develop a year or so. But I think he's going to be outstanding. I won't be surprised if they get one of those two guys. Then in the secondary, Savion Smith went through the bowl practices. The junior college player that originally signed with LSU, he's a five-star recruit a couple of years ago, signed with LSU, went to junior college, ended up transferring to junior college from LSU. And he had some really outstanding bowl practices here in Tuscaloosa, by the way, so he's already enrolled. And then Jalen Armour-Davis is a very versatile player. Both he and Savion Smith are corners, though Jalen Armour-Davis could play corner, could play star, could play safety.
Yeah.
So he has a lot of versatility. And then the third guy they signed in the secondary, Joshua Jobe, out of Cheshire Academy up in Connecticut, originally from Miami, was committed to Miami, but he flipped to Alabama and signed with Alabama. What a great player he is as a cornerback prospect. So I thought they did really strong in those areas, Scott, on the defensive side. And again, as we mentioned, there's other guys that they signed, and there are certainly others that they are recruiting as we start to head towards a stretch run on the defensive side as well as the offensive side.
One is Patrick Surtain Jr., as you know, a teammate of his, South Florida. Where's Alabama on that? It's not over with, right?
Right. Patrick Surtain out of Plantation American Heritage down in Florida. His teammate is Tyson Campbell, who some people actually think may be better than Surtain, maybe the best corner in the country. Alabama, Georgia, and Miami there. I really don't know. Georgia seems to be confident. Miami seems to have some confidence, and even Alabama thinks they're right in the middle of it. So we'll see there on Tyson Campbell. I think Surtain probably leaning towards LSU. And, we'll see what happens with the kid out in California, Isaac Taylor Stewart from San Diego. He's a guy that may visit Alabama. And he's a guy with a lot of speed. Texas A&M's in there. Georgia's in there. USC. So, we'll see. Some things can happen over the stretch run, and maybe Alabama can close the gap on one of those guys.
What did Alabama lose with Nadab Joseph flipping to Georgia? Luke Ford, the big tight end from Illinois that Alabama coveted, going to Georgia as well. Georgia had a fantastic early signing period, as you know. And then Dominique Wood-Anderson, another tight end that Jeremy Pruitt got at Tennessee that could have gone to Alabama.
Yep. Yeah, I think Dominic Wood-Anderson clearly was the guy Alabama wanted all along, a junior college player out of Arizona Western. I think they thought he had skills similar to O.J. Howard. And, but he was a guy that went so back and forth. I don't think Alabama ever really put a lot of stock in what he might do. because he did go back and forth so much and changed. Was committed to Texas. I think he one time might have been committed to Oregon. So again, he and he ended up at Tennessee. So that was a big pickup for Jeremy Pruitt. As far as Luke Ford, the tight end out of Carterville, Illinois, that's a guy that really, I think when Michael Parker out of Huntsville, Westminster Christian Academy, I think when he committed to Alabama, that really made Luke Ford, that kind of freed you up a spot instead of taking another tight end like that. I really think that kind of freed up Alabama to, save that spot for another position. Because when you look at Michael Parker, he's a better athlete than Luke Ford. Maybe not quite as big right now, 6'6", 230, whereas, Luke Ford's already, 6'6", 6'7", 250, 260, whatever it is. But this guy's a better athlete than Luke Ford. He moves better. He's an outstanding basketball player. The difference is that he doesn't have the stars by his name like Luke Ford.
So you're saying
I think
he's really Miller Forrestall, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's an outstanding talent. I mean, this guy's gifted. I mean, when you look at him athletically, he can move. He has great size. He has a frame to really fill out. His two brothers are walk-ons at Alabama, so he kind of has a little bit of a pedigree. Just an outstanding athlete. I really think it's an outstanding pickup. Now, listen, he hasn't signed yet. There's discussion that, and again, that's scuttlebutt. That's between the coaching staff and Michael Parker. But, there's talk that maybe he'll blue shirt, and again, that he hasn't confirmed that to us. But, regardless of whatever, that's certainly up to him and the coaching staff. We'll see what happens. But I think it's a huge pickup eventually. He's going to be an outstanding player as he develops.
And at the end of the day, tight end is, you could argue, maybe the strongest and deepest position on the football team right now.
Yeah, I mean, Hell Hinches will be back, obviously, next year. You've got Irv Smith, who I think is a great talent. I mean, that's another one when you're talking about getting the ball to people.
He had one catch.
Alabama has these Alabama tight ends, I mean, especially Irv Smith, they can be difference makers in the passing game. And I know that Dable certainly wants to get them involved. But regardless, back to the recruiting, I think that when you look at the depth that Alabama has at tight end, you get Michael Parker. I think right now you're fine. Miller Forrestall will be back next year. So, again, you've got Kedrick James, who is a true freshman this year. You also have Major Tennyson, who is a true freshman. Both those guys very, very promising. So I think you're okay at tight end. I really don't see the need there unless you felt like there was a guy that was a difference maker like Dominic Wood-Anderson.
All right, so as we wrap up here, Georgia had an amazing early signing period. They do go head-to-head with Alabama, probably as much as anybody in America. Some fans will overstate it. Some will understate it. I want Rodney Orr, who's been a recruiting expert for 20-plus years, to tell me how important this matchup is for recruiting. We've already talked about the game, but what about the outcome and what happens for recruiting with these two? And do you even agree with that assessment?
Well, I think to some extent, I think it certainly is something that, if Georgia wins, then Kirby Smart's got another selling point on the recruiting trail. I mean, he's been telling everybody that, hey, we're the next Alabama. We're phasing in, they're phasing out. I mean, that's what he's telling people on the recruiting trail. That's what he's telling prospects. And, if they were to win the game, that certainly solidifies the things that he's been saying, I would think. But listen, here's the deal. They've got a great natural base over there in Georgia, so it really doesn't matter. They're going to recruit well because they're going to get most of those guys. It's going to be difficult to get the best players out of Georgia unless those guys just don't want to go to Georgia. So I think that it could be helpful to some extent on some prospects maybe. But I don't know in terms of Georgia's perspective that it's really going to hurt them if they were to lose because they're going to recruit their state very, very well.
All right, great stuff as always from Rodney Orr, TiderInsider.com. Scott Griffin of Tide and Tiger as well, where we have all the videos of not only football but basketball games. Rodney and I's thoughts and different things. We'll continue with the podcast and more as we go. Obviously, recruiting will be coming up. We'll be keeping an eye on that with the February recruiting period, and I think it's going to be a very interesting spring as well. But first, we'll have a championship game in about a week, so look for another podcast later as we get closer to that and our thoughts on Alabama and Georgia. We always appreciate you listening. For Rodney Orr, again, TiderInsider.com, only $48 a year. All the great message forums and different things they have. Scott Griffin, Tide and Tiger, saying so long this time. We'll talk to you again in a few days right here on the podcast.